Okay, guys, this week I'm having a little trouble with my camera again, so I apologize. So it's going to be a bit more like a podcast, but I'll have the slides going. I got to get my webcam replaced. But okay, so we've spent the last few weeks in some pretty deep sort of philosophical territory. We've asked whether reason can prove God exists, and we watched Hume's characters take that question apart from all kinds of directions. We looked at Plato's argument that the ordinary world is like shadows on a cave wall, and that only reason can reach what's truly real. And these are some of the biggest questions, really, in the history of philosophy. And I hope you've come away with them with a real sense of how hard and even if they're very abstract, at least how important they are. So, but I want to shift the frame a little bit. We're going to now put the question of God's existence to the side just for this week. Not because it's unimportant at all, but because there's a related question that, if anything, is even a little more personal and pressing. And if there's one thing that everything in this final unit has, it's that I wanted to try to make everything a little bit more personal, or at least tied to some of the ways that philosophy can actually be something that directly addresses you. And one of the biggest issues you can do with that is to ask about the meaning of life, but not just any life, but your life. And that's one of the biggest questions that most of us actually wrestle with, even if we don't always use philosophical language for it. But we wonder, does our life mean anything? Does it matter that I'm here? Or in a different vein, we can ask, is what I'm doing really worthwhile? And that's a question that all of, or both of this week's readings are about. And the framing I want to give you is, what are some ways that life can have meaning even without religion? Okay. Even without the context of God. So both of our authors this week, Albert Camus and Susan Wolf, are trying to answer that question. And they both agree that meaning doesn't require God, exactly. But what's interesting is they both disagree, in some interestingly different ways, about what a meaningful life does require. And getting clear on that disagreement is really the main sort of philosophical work of this week. Okay, so we're going to start with Albert Camus, who used to be that many people would have to read a book of his called The Stranger in high school when they were studying existentialism. At least I know I did. And what existentialism is in general, this won't be on the test, but existentialism is sort of the whole study of this question of, how do we find meaning in a life that starts with just the very fact of our existence here, without any reference to something eternal, something divine, something beyond? How do we find meaning just in existence itself? So if you ever hear that term existentialism, that's pretty much what it's asking about. But Camus was one of the most famous existentialist writers, and he was more of a novelist really than a philosopher, but he was both. And he wrote a very famous piece that we're going to read a piece of for this. So he was a French philosopher, novelist. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, I believe. He wrote in the shadow of both the first two world wars. It was in Europe, where all the old sort of religious and political, philosophical certainties had been sort of shown to be empty and had collapsed in pretty dramatic ways. If you know anything about the early half of 20th century history, you know that that's one of the big social consequences of those wars, was that people stopped believing in things. They stopped believing in religion. They stopped believing in politics. They stopped believing in all kinds of things that had a whole lot of meaning before then, or that had been much more traditional. So people reacting to that sense of meaninglessness was very, very intense during this period. But Camus was deeply interested in what it means to live very honestly in a world where there are no guarantees and no cosmic sort of reassurance, and by guarantee or cosmic reassurance, I mean there's no God telling you, yes, everything's going to be okay, even if it doesn't seem like it right now. Excuse me. So, his central concept is what we're gonna, or what he calls the absurd. And I want to be precise about what he really means by this, because people use the word absurd a lot of times just to mean like when something's kind of silly or something's kind of ridiculous. But that's not what Camus means. He doesn't just mean, it doesn't make sense. For Camus, the absurd, it's not it's not a property of just the world alone. Like sometimes people will say the world seems absurd when there's sort of craziness going on, but that's not quite what he means. It's not just that for him the universe is meaningless or that it doesn't make sense. It's also not a property of sort of human beings alone. It's not just that we're confused or foolish or want to find meaning, but are just bad at doing it. What he calls the absurd arises from really the collision of two facts. Okay, so two things that are out that are facts that come into conflict, and that gives rise to the absurd. So first, he says that we're conscious beings who desperately want things to matter. We want our suffering to mean something. We want our efforts to add up to something. We want the universe to have a point. And for most people, this longing is not optional. It's part of what it means to be human, is to really want there to be some meaning or some purpose. Second, he says, though, the universe is completely silent in response. It doesn't seem to care. And so that's a depressing thing, but that's sort of what he takes as a fact, is that we want meaning, but the universe doesn't seem to offer it. We have to look for things behind the world, like God or invisible things or long distance things, in order to find meaning. And so for him, the universe offers no purpose. There's no sort of justification for why we're here. There's no answer to the questions of what it is we're doing here. The universe just is. The absurd, then, is what happens when those two things collide. Okay, when our need for meaning crashes against the universe's sort of indifference. And Camus thinks that collision is really the fundamental condition of human life, that we're all in it, and basically we have this strong need or sense for purpose, but we're in a world that doesn't provide it, and that creates this sense of the absurd, that combination. And the problem is, he says, we just don't always see that clearly. And part of what existentialism in general often tried to do was to make people honest about that, was how they would see it. So Camus uses the myth of Sisyphus to tell that story. And where's my slide about Sisyphus? Oh, okay. So got to tell you the story here. The myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods. He was a man condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain forever. So, and this is an old Greek myth. Every time he pushes the boulder to the top, it rolls down again, and he has to start over again. So there's no progress, there's no end, there's no purpose to anything. And the gods designed this as the kind of ultimate punishment, precisely because it's pointless, because there's sort of no point in the task, but it doesn't end. And so he likes that story because he thinks this is us. Not because our lives are punishment, but because the structure of that myth is the same. He says we pour ourselves into projects, we build things, we fall in love, we pursue goals, and then we die. And eventually everything we built crumbles, and the universe rolls on like we'd never existed. And he says that if you zoom out far enough, every human life looks something like Sisyphus rolling his boulder up the hill again, only to watch it fall down again, and then you start all over. But it's just this sort of endless cycle. So depressing, very, very depressing. And Camus can be read as a very depressing guy. But he wants to find a way out of this. Okay. So for him, this is where he makes his crucial move. He says there are really kind of three possible responses to recognizing this condition. He says the first is suicide. Just end your life because it has no meaning. And right off the bat, he says no. He rejects that. He thinks that's a refusal to actually face the problem. And all you're doing is running away from the problem rather than facing up to it. Okay, so that's his first thing. He's like meaningless. That I want to make that clear from the beginning. Even one of the most depressing philosophers in the world said suicide is not an answer. It's not a response. Even he said it's just giving up. He said there are other ways. There are better ways. And so that's the first one. The second response is what he calls philosophical suicide, which means adopting some belief system, religious or otherwise, that gives the universe a meaning it doesn't actually have, that sort of lets you pretend the boulder is going somewhere even though you know it's not. And Camus rejects this too. He calls this self-deception, sort of a way of looking away from the truth rather than confronting it. And he would include in this category things like conventional religion, but also sort of any ideology or belief that offers some kind of, large-scale comfort in any way at all. The third response is the one he endorses. And what he does is he calls it revolt or rebellion. And what this means is accepting the absurd fully, looking at it directly, not flinching away, not pretending that it's not there, without hoping it'll go away, and then living anyway, but living fully and consciously without false hope, but also without despair. And rebellion is what he really calls that. That's the term that I think he really likes, revolt or rebellion, but especially rebellion. In other words, it's kind of saying, it's kind of, giving the middle finger to the universe and its meaninglessness and saying, I'm going to live well anyway, regardless of that. So what he sees is that it's actually a very active and for him, very positive approach to this. And this is where what's called the famous dissent comes in. What he says, Camus says, the moment that really interests him in the story of Sisyphus is not when Sisyphus is pushing the boulder up the hill, straining and struggling and whatnot. It's when he walks back down the mountain to start over again. After the boulder's fallen down, he walks back down the mountain and he decides, I'm going to go again. I'm going to push it again. And in that moment, sort of between the effort and its failure, its inevitable failure, Sisyphus is conscious of his condition. Like, he knows exactly what his situation is. And Camus says that in that moment, Sisyphus is stronger than his fate, that he's superior to the gods who condemned him. And really, the key point here is a sort of a clarity, this like lucidity, this clear-eyed refusal to lie to yourself about your situation. That for Camus, that's a form of victory. And what he says is that Sisyphus doesn't win by sort of escaping the boulder. He doesn't win by getting out of this situation. He doesn't win by ever doing anything differently. He wins by changing his attitude. He wins by owning the boulder, by facing his condition without sort of pretense and continuing anyway. And there's a quote that I like that says, there's no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. And that's that sense of rebellion that he means. He's sort of like saying, yeah, there's I'll be honest, there's a little bit of a screw you attitude in this. It's like, if that's what the universe is going to give me, you know what? I don't care. I'm going to fight back. And then comes the line that's made this essay really famous. And he says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And what he means is that not happy in the sense of being content with his situation, by not happy by saying, yes, this is a good thing. It's not happy because everything worked out. It's happy in the sense of being fully alive, fully conscious, fully himself, sort of in full possession of his fate rather than being crushed by it. It's a really strange, but also very demanding kind of happiness. But Camus means that very seriously. So I want to pause here just to clarify a couple things, because a lot of times people misread what Camus is saying and sort of misread him in two opposite directions. And the first is to think that what he's saying is that nothing matters and we should all just accept pointlessness with a kind of shrug and just be like, okay, whatever. life is what it is, just that's it. But that's not his view. I mean, Camus actually thinks that passionate engagement with life is essential. And what he says is he doesn't think that Sisyphus is someone who thinks that the world is totally meaningless. And he's not just sort of indifferent. He hasn't given up. He pushes the boulder. He feels the effort and he feels the weight and he suffers the failure. But that sense of sort of scorn or of rebellion is itself a kind of intense engagement with life. And another way to put it would be that what he sees Sisyphus is doing as just diving in and saying, you know what, I'm going to live this moment fully as much as I can. Even if I know it's going to end up in failure in the end, I'm going to choose this as my way of living and choose to live this way as passionately and as thoroughly as I possibly can. So that's different from just being like just saying, giving it up, and we should all just sort of just play video games all day. Okay, so but the second misreading is to think that he's really sort of offering a route to happiness and meaning that's just as comforting as any other religion, and that's also not quite right. Because he doesn't think that Sisyphus in this situation is ever really going to be satisfied. But the whole point is sort of loving that struggle. But it is a struggle. So, but Camus is really honest that the comfort that this view really offers is really a good word for it is austere, like it's stark. There's no promised reward. There's no sort of vindication or victory waiting somewhere at the end. There's no sort of cosmic justice. But what he offers is dignity. Is this sort of dignity of facing your situation honestly and refusing to be diminished by it, by just absolutely refusing to say, I will not be turned into a hopeless, empty husk. I will fight and live even if I know I'm going to fail. Now, whether or not that's enough is a question that I think is genuinely open. But it's an important reading because especially in the 20th century, there were a lot of people who found real strength in this idea and who found a real, honestly, in a weird way, life-affirming viewpoint that said it kind of gave people the sense of having permission to be able to live their lives fully, even if they didn't think there was a God, or even if they didn't think that everything was going to necessarily work out in the end. It was a way to say, you know what? You living life completely and accepting the challenge of this kind of awful situation and fighting anyway, that is strength. That is courage. That is true dignity. And you're doing it without any illusions. You're doing it without any sense of sort of false comfort. You're just like waking up every morning, no illusions, and getting up and saying, I'm going to live this day as much as I can. So that's Camus. That's the way to think about Camus that I think is actually at least what he hopes is supposed to be a very positive kind of approach to this. Now, not everybody agrees, and we're going to move to someone who has a very different view. But just to step back again and just remind you, what we're looking at this week are people who are looking at ways to find a kind of meaning in life, even if there's no sort of guarantee that life is meaningful, like a God or a religion or something like that. So Camus is one way. It's one manner of doing things. And by the way, lots of people disagree with Camus. So if you find yourself not in complete agreement with Camus, you're not alone. Okay. So let's move to a different one. And this is Susan Wolf, who kind of has a different approach. And it's important, the title of her work, which is The Meanings, Plural, of Lives. So Susan Wolf's contemporary American philosopher, and her approach to the meaning of life is very different from Camus'. And she's writing very carefully, very analytically, making distinctions and building arguments rather than painting images like Camus really did. But she's asking a deeply related question. So she starts by making a distinction that I think is genuinely clarifying. And it's easy to miss because both questions kind of use the same words. But the first question is, what is the meaning of life? And this way of asking it is asking for a kind of cosmic, even religious purpose. So, why does humanity exist? What's the point of it all? And Wolf is fairly pessimistic about this question. Okay, she thinks that without specific religious sort of metaphysics, or without God who created us for a reason, that this answer this question probably has no satisfying answer. And she's not even going to try to answer it in this piece. And she's sort of not embarrassed about that. She just says, look, that's not the question I'm going to try to answer. I'm kind of not even interested in it. The second question is hers. And it's like, what makes a particular life meaningful? And to her, this is asking something much more local. Local, I think, is a good way to put it. So not why does humanity exist, but what gives your life or my life a sense of worth and purpose? And Wolf thinks that this question has much better prospects. Crucially, she thinks that the answer to the second question doesn't really even necessarily have anything at all to do with the meaning of the first question. Individual lives, she thinks, can be very meaningful, even if there's no cosmic meaning to the whole thing. And that's a position that a lot of people are surprised by. But I think it's an original approach, and so I wanted to bring it up, especially because it's in many ways a less sort of tragic view than Camus, but still sort of doesn't look for an answer in a god or in a sort of cosmic reassurance that life will have a meaning. So her key move here is really just to say you don't need God or any kind of cosmic purpose or some sort of grand narrative about humanity's purpose here to have a meaningful life. What she says is the question of meaning in your life is really separate from the question of meaning to life in general. And she has something substantive that she wants to say about the question of how can you have a meaningful life, even if she thinks there may not be an answer to the original question about what is the meaning of life. Sorry, my notes on that confused me for a second there. but she's got a good answer to meaning in life, but says she's not even really concerned with the meaning of life. Okay, so what makes a particular life meaningful? And Wolf builds her answer by looking at sort of obviously meaningless lives first, which is a kind of clever philosophical move. And what she does is identifies what's missing in clear cases of meaninglessness so she can figure out what ingredients to life having a meaningful life actually requires. Okay. So she gives us three sort of paradigm cases of meaningless lives. And the first she calls the blob. And this is a person who spends sort of day after day in just sort of passive consumption, like watching television, drinking, disconnected from everyone, not doing anything, not doing anything. Someone who's not necessarily unhappy, but they're just totally disengaged from life in any active way. Okay. That's the sort of person who's just given up. Okay. Just sort of, just goes for simple, not even pleasures so much as just simple gratifications. And that's it. That's for her, that's the blob. The second category she calls the useless. And that's people who are really active, but whose activities are hollow. So like an idle rich person who kind of, spends lots of money on different amusements, but has no real purpose. Or like, a stereotype would be like a corporate executive who kind of grinds away for 70-hour weeks, but has no real goal except for, getting rich just for the sake of getting rich. And then there's the third that she calls the bankrupt, which is people who dedicate themselves to projects that fail, not because they necessarily had bad values, but because of bad luck. Okay, and this is different from the first two. The first two are ones that I think a lot of people would, in one way or another, say, yeah, those are probably kind of meaningless lives. That they're a little selfish. They're a little, just either self-focused or just not really trying in the first case and not really trying to do anything good in the second case. The third is a weird one because I think a lot of people don't want to admit that this might be a kind of meaningless life, because what it is you got someone who really tried but they failed. Okay, not because they did something necessarily wrong or had some bad intention, I should say, but just because of bad luck. Like some scientist whose life's research is like stolen at the last minute, or a business person who had a really good idea for a good, productive, helpful tool and wanted to do it so that they could pass on wealth to their children, but only for technology to make it obsolete or something like that. They made a real attempt, but it didn't work. And for her, that's also a meaningless life, and that's the hard one for a lot of people to admit. But if you look at each of these, there's something missing. So what the blob is missing is sort of active engagement in the world. They're not even trying to engage. The useless person is missing real value. Like they're just being selfish. They're doing nothing but being ultimately selfish. And then the third one is the more original one, which is that sometimes people want to say doesn't matter, but she thinks actually does, which is actually achieving something. Okay, success. So, those are the three things that are missing. And what she does is she turns those into what she thinks a meaningful life has to have. Okay, so from these cases, these are the three ingredients for a meaningful life. So you need active engagement, not just sort of passive drifting through life. You need to truly be invested in your life. You also need genuine positive value, that the things you engage with should actually matter. Not just feel like they matter to you, but actually, do something for the world, for other people. It has to be objective. It actually has to serve some value rather than just be something that you personally think kind of makes you feel good or something. Because if that's all it is, then you are just sort of back with the business executive who makes money just to be rich and exploit people. And then the third one is the one that means you need some degree of success. That meaning requires that your engagement, actually goes somewhere. That you manage to actually do or produce or contribute something, even if it's modest. And the weird thing about that one is that it might actually require a little luck. But she thinks that in some cases, it may be the case that a truly, ultimately meaningful life may have a little luck. But I think she thinks that most people would probably agree that at some level, you want to be successful at what you're trying to do. If you're trying to help people, you want to actually help people, right? It's good to have that good intention. It's better to have a good intention and to achieve it at the same time. So ultimately, her formula is a meaningful life is one that actively and at least somewhat successfully engages in projects of positive value. Okay, so that's what her sort of definition of a meaningful life is, and that's how she gets to that. That's how she gets that. And one of the most demanding parts to me of this is that third one, the requirement that the value has to be real. Or sorry, the second one, that the positive value has to be real and not just felt, because she explicitly rejects the idea that meaning is just like a subjective impression, just whatever feels meaningful to you. Okay, and that's a very common thing that people will say, right? Is that what you should do is your own personal passion, that you should live to the thing that you personally think is important. And she's like, well, it depends. But here's why she rejects that. So imagine someone who's been in a cult their whole life. Okay, they're super deeply invested in something that everybody else on the outside sees as genuinely worthless. From the inside, their life feels tremendously meaningful, right? They're passionately engaged in all kinds of projects they believe in, but the projects are ultimately delusional and the values are kind of bankrupt. And Wolf thinks that we want to say, probably if we're honest, that this life is actually less meaningful than it feels. And not just that the person is mistaken about what's meaningful. So in other words, she says the experience of meaning is not the same as having meaning. In other words, she says that if we're all going to be honest about it, there are certain things that we think are valuable and certain things, and we can make a distinction between, oh, it's just your opinion, or oh, it's just your perspective. The certain things really are objectively more valuable. And she has a even more pointed version of this argument. She says, imagine having a pill that would make you feel your life was deeply meaningful without anything changing about what you actually do or achieve. Would taking that pill give you a meaningful life? Right? It's not going to change anything about how you live your life. It's not going to change anything objective. It's just going to make you feel that everything you do is super good, super meaningful, super important. Does that actually make your life meaningful? Her answer is that it's clearly not, right? And if meaning were just a feeling, then taking that pill would make your life meaningful. But the fact that most people would agree that, yeah, just taking a pill to make your life feel meaningful wouldn't really do it. For her, that's how you have the difference there between just sort of feeling that something is meaningful to you personally and it actually being that case. So meaning requires real positive value, okay, for her, something actually worthwhile from outside your own perspective. Now, she's deliberately vague about what counts as objectively valuable, and she acknowledges that that's like a vulnerability in her view, but she points in a certain direction, that like things like art, science, relationships, care for others, the development of genuine excellence, that these things seem to have worth that's not just conferred by sort of the enthusiasm of the people doing them. Okay, so that there are things that we find have true positive value beyond just what someone thinks. Now, we could argue about all kinds of sort of edge cases and things like that, but that's her general approach right here. And here she invokes Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, or flourishing, as really the kind of closest precedent for what she's describing. And what she says is that a life is truly flourishing if it's not just that it feels good from the inside, but it's a life that's actually going well in ways that matter and that other people can recognize as mattering. Okay, so let's put the two of these two together. Let's do some compare and contrast here. Okay, so Camus grounds his account of a worthwhile life totally in a subjective posture. Okay. The consciousness that recognizes the absurd and responds with like being rebellious, right? That's a very subjective approach. So Camus is very much saying it's really about the attitude that you have toward this sort of meaningless life. That's what really gives life meaning. But it's completely internal, right? Because if you think about Wolf's requirements for a meaningful life, Sisyphus' life pretty much has no value at all, right? It's got no positive value. His projects don't accomplish anything. He never succeeds. The activity itself is super pointless. Camus says none of that matters. And what matters for Camus is totally the attitude that Sisyphus takes towards his condition. It's all about that sort of courageous dignity with which he pursues whatever it is he's going to pursue. And Wolf would probably say that Sisyphus, on her view, unfortunately, he's living a meaningless life. And that Camus' move, while sort of admirable in its honesty about the human condition, it's essentially a really just sophisticated version of an attitude adjustment. It's just taking the pill. And she thinks that's not enough. So feeling at peace with a meaningless situation, or even sort of like rebelling against it heroically, she's like, that doesn't make the situation itself meaningful. It might make it more bearable. It might make it easier to endure, but it doesn't actually make it more meaningful. And Wolf thinks there's a way you should aim for a more meaningful life. Camus might respond with a harder question. Okay, so Wolf says that meaning requires some sort of genuine objective value, but Camus might ask, where does that actual objective value come from? If it's not coming from God, like if it's not from God, who decides what is genuinely worthwhile versus merely just seeming so to someone else? So if the universe is totally indifferent and there's no sort of cosmic or religious purpose, are there any grounds to distinguish between what's genuinely valuable and what's only apparently valuable to some people? In other words, is Wolf's sort of objective value just like a philosophical invention rather than, and just another kind of false hope that Camus rejects? And in the end, that's really kind of the genuine tension, I think, between them. The Camus says meaning is an attitude you take toward your own life, and the world doesn't give it to you, and it can't take it away. But Wolf says no, meaning requires actual engagement with genuine value in the world. And she says the right attitude isn't enough if you're not actually doing something worthwhile. So both are trying to answer the question of how life can have meaning without God. And they give very different answers. And one thing I think that's interesting is neither one is necessarily obviously right. That there's something to each of them. And I think it's an interesting way to look at those two. So I want to close this week by connecting with some of the bigger threads we've been following. So earlier in the semester, we asked about the meaning of life in sort of a more religious context with Aquinas, and then through Hume's sort of critique of arguments for God. And the implicit assumption in a lot of that discussion was that if God doesn't exist, life might be meaningless, or at least that like the question of meaning is really, at the very least, the question of meaning is really tied closely to the question of God. And both Camus and Wolf challenge that assumption directly. Okay, they're both saying even if there is no God, even if Hume's skepticism is right and the universe is just sort of this series of events with no necessary structure behind any of it, you can still live a life that has genuine worth. Okay, so Wolf's account then, I think, connects back to Aristotle from the Ethics Unit. And Aristotle, again, that term eudaimonia, or human flourishing, that was always tied to actually living well and really doing well, not just to sort of feeling good or having a good perspective. And Wolf is making a similar move. Okay, so meaning for her is not just a feeling, it's a way of actually engaging with the world. And that connection, I think, is really worth noticing. But then Camus connects back to an even older thread in the course. And his picture of the human condition, where we're sort of thrown into a world that has no meaning and have to create something out of nothing, that's more of a response to that same disorienting situation that Hume's world kind of creates. That if we can't know what's ultimately real, and if causation and sort of all the ways that we try to make sense of the world is just a habit, and if reason can't reach the foundation like Descartes kind of wanted to, then all we have is just sort of, there's just streams of impressions, there's no self behind them. And in that case, we already are in Camus' universe. And Camus kind of asking, okay, now what? And I think that's sort of where you can look at the larger consequences to some of those other questions that might have seemed more abstract, like the ethics questions or Hume and Descartes' sort of positions on these sort of nebulous questions. But they can become personal when you sort of think about the consequences and say, oh, well, if Hume's right and there's no way to really make sense of the world, then are we left in a world like Camus describes? Or are there other ways to look at things? And so both Camus and Wolf sort of accept that kind of view and then come up with different ways to try to find meaning even in that sort of godless world. And I think that's a very interesting approach. Whether or not you ultimately find those compelling or whether or not you agree with them is a big question. And it's one that lots of people wrestle with their entire lives. But I think they're two interesting approaches, especially Wolf's, because it's a much more positive approach than I think a lot of sort of existential approaches or approaches that say, let's not worry about the question of whether God exists. Let's try to find meaning even in a world without God. And what can we find? And I think it's a pretty productive move in a lot of ways. So that's one way to bring some of these questions of the course back personally to you. In the next couple weeks, we're going to go to a much more sort of down to earth kind of way that doesn't have quite so broad implications, but is something that actually is affecting most of you guys very immediately right now. And that's the question of whether or not you should be using AI and what it's doing for you and what it's doing to you. And that's going to be our next set of questions. All right. So I'll see you then.